After a year in power, discontent seems to be brewing in the Congress government in Karnataka over the naming of 3 more deputy chief ministers along caste lines. On June 27th, this issue took a twist when a seer belonging to a Vokkaliga mutt publicly requested Siddaramaiah to vacate the CM's seat for DK Shivkumar. The following day, another seer belonging to a Veerashaiva Lingayat mutt requested that the CM's post be given to a leader from their community. But why are seers even making such statements? What role do mathas or caste-based spiritual and religious institutions have to play in Karnataka's politics? Namaskara. Welcome to Decode Karnataka, a show where we give you the most incisive analysis on everything you need to know about the state. Whether it is running educational and medical institutions, engaging in charity and development works, or endorsing candidates and lobbying for ministerial berths, mathas or mutts are institutions peculiar to the state of Karnataka. The state is home to hundreds of mathas representing the many castes and subcastes in Karnataka. Politically significant among them are the Lingayats, Vokkaligas and Kurubas mathas. Over the years, Karnataka has seen a growing interdependence between the pontiffs and the politicians. Today, some say that these spiritual and religious institutions can even make or break a candidate's electoral fortunes. Successive governments have also supported these mathas, whether by association of their high-profile leaders, allocation of land, or budgetary grants. But how did these mathas and pontiffs gain followers and clout to become so crucial to Karnataka's political landscape? How has this affected the state's electoral and identity politics? Let's discuss with Janaki Nair, a Bengaluru-based historian and retired professor, Center for Historical Studies, JNU. Hi ma'am, thank you for joining us today. Let me begin by saying this, that Karnataka is unique in that almost every caste and subcaste has its own matha running into hundreds today. From their early 20th century status as spiritual institutions, mathas today have emerged as centers of immense power in terms of political, cultural and social clout. How did this evolution happen?
Let me start by correcting you. Actually, there are not hundreds, but thousands of mathas.
Okay.
But you're quite right. There has been a proliferation of mathas of late. But before I talk about that, I would like to say a few things about the kinds of transitions that have occurred in this particular institutional form since, say, about the middle of the 19th century, which is the period I know the best. So you had two kinds of mathas, the Brahmin mathas, particularly headed by Srigeri, and the Lingayat mathas. But there weren't as many as there are today, even, of Lingayat mathas. In fact, Narayanapura says many mathas also collapse and decline and become defunct. Others keep growing and so on. So it's it's an institution which is always in flux. That said, I should say the 19th century was an interesting moment because you had a lot of smaller subsects of the Lingayats wanting to establish mathas. So, for instance, I'm sure you know the Srigeri Matha, which is one of the most important mathas in Karnataka today, most powerful, in fact, had its origins in the 19th century in actually being able to break away from the important Chitradurga Matha, the Muruga Matha.
Okay. Yeah.
So two or three kinds of struggles were happening, I would say, at this time. One was the struggle between the Brahmin Matha and the Lingayat Mathas, where the Lingayats were actually demanding certain kinds of birudugalu, the honors, and fighting for those honors. And a lot of these cases actually went to court and were decided in court as to what kinds of honors the Lingayat Matha was entitled to, as opposed to the Brahmin Matha. And likewise, within the Lingayat framework, there were struggles by, for example, the Sadara Lingayats and the Nonabas to establish their own mathas. And the interesting thing that happens in the 19th century is, of course, from the 1880s, you have the establishment of the Muzrai department, which is an assertion of bureaucratic power over temples and also particularly mathas. It is interesting because the establishment of matha owes its origins owes its roots rather to these kinds of bureaucratic decisions, court cases. It was not necessarily the nirup or the sanad of the king that was established, was leading to the sort of establishment of these mathas. So that's one interesting shift that happens in the late 19th century. And of course, as I said, Sirigiri is one of the most important examples of this kind of shift that is happening. But having said that, the mathas were very, very important to any kind of secular power, that is to say, to kingship. Yeah. So there was, and in fact, my friend and colleague who's also studied the mathas, Aya Ikegame, has mentioned, referred to it as a form of stateness. Okay. And she is not wrong that they themselves were constituting a part of the state in terms of, the kinds of rituals and the kinds of formal powers that they actually shared with secular power. So there's always been a fairly intimate link. I would say. I personally feel that the Muzrai department resets that. Okay. So what happens in the 19th century is, as a result of all these kinds of struggles over honors and so on and so forth, the Muzrai department feels impelled to intervene and to rank mathas according to importance. Sringeri, of course, is at the top, and rank their honors as well according to their relative importance, as a way of settling these disputes, more firmly. Okay. I'm not saying that disputes were necessarily settled, but it was an interesting moment of flux where you had a government department actually asserting a certain kind of power, secular power, if you like, over these religious institutions. And that has, of course, changed of late, particularly since 2000, when the law itself has been changed to make them freer in some ways. Accountable to the state only in order to pay income tax. So they are not otherwise actually accountable to the state anymore. So yeah, that's the background against which they have assumed this power and importance. They also took on, as you know, the role of establishing certain kinds of institutions. I feel that the Lingayat mathas made up for what the state was not doing, especially in the realm of education. So they start by establishing hostels for students who want to go to colleges and schools in the towns and bigger centers, and then move on to themselves to setting up educational institutions. And that happens in a fairly short period of time. So they are able to establish a fairly large presence in the educational world, partly because of the failures of the state. The state was very parsimonious about investing in education. So you have this Lingayat Matha especially becoming the norm for, a certain kind of public engagement. Professor M.M. Kalburgi, who unfortunately we lost a few years ago, was somebody who made this very important distinction between the Brahmin and the Lingayat mathas. He said one is Dharmamukhi and the other is Samajmukhi. So the Lingayat mathas are Samajmukhi. They are by definition engaged with the world of the secular in terms of education and in terms of engagement with people's issues and so on and so forth.
You spoke of how they build educational institutions. They also use social welfare and development to sort of build a follower base and gain their trust and influence, build influence among people. But at the core of it, however, was the larger objective of consolidation of caste power. And mathas have been at the forefront of demanding representation and reservation for their respective communities. Politicians also have relied on mathas for their support. So at what point did this interdependence happen, and what point did it deepen, and how has this shaped Karnataka's politics today?
Yeah, I want to back up here to say that some of these developments are more recent. If I can go back to history again, there are some very important ways in which mathas mediated, for example, disputes within the community, and that's a very old tradition. Yeah. So this question of building up support and building up trust very much relied on those functions of the matha, in addition to, of course, the kind of commitment to scholarship that the mathas had. But since I would say the realm of since the arrival of electoral politics, since independence, really speaking, the relationship of the Matha to the state obviously has changed, and in very important ways. So, but for right from the outset, as I told you, historically the Matha has never been far away from seat of temporal power. It has never been far away. And this is true even in the post-independence period. I would say the 1880s to 1940s is a brief interregnum when the Muzrai department is all powerful. But otherwise, you have a resetting of this relationship. If I can give you the example of the Sirigire Matha, for instance, Nijilingappa in his own autobiography, because he belonged to the Muruga Matha of the Chittadurga, the main town, and of course he's a Banajiga Lingayat. He was campaigned against by the Sirigire Matha when he stood for elections. And yet, when you go to the Sirigire Matha, you see the photographs of almost all political leaders on the walls. And Nijlingappa is one of them. So, everybody had to make their peace with Mathas, especially those Mathas that are so important. And in the Matha, in turn, needed to have that particular access open, the access to public political figures. So there has been a necessary, relationship between these two realms without a certain kind of sharing of power, if you like, without necessarily encroaching on each other's powers. Having said that, you mentioned the word development. And certainly, I know that the Sirigire Matha, for instance, and the current Swamiji has very actively intervened in irrigation projects in the region. So, in some ways, he is enabling the state to perform its functions, if you like, putting a little pressure on the state to fulfill its, duties towards citizens and so on. I think many Mathas are actually participating in developmental issues in the regions where they function, without which they would not have the kind of following and the kind of respect of people. So there has been a shift in the role of the Matha. So the Sirigire Matha, again, if I can take that example, has a Monday Nyaya Pitha in which many kinds of extremely secular issues are actually decided. It functions as a kind of an informal court. It functions in alliance with state legal mechanisms. It is not in opposition to them, and it doesn't in any way undermine them frequently. So it's a situation of mutual interdependence. There are cases where the High Court actually refers certain cases to the Nyayapita in order for resolution, and vice versa. So there is a very intimate link between state power and its apparatuses and the Matha's own authority, which is basically moral authority. It's not legal authority as in the case of the Nyayapita, but it's definitely, is drawing on or building up, as it were, a support of the community for these activities. What I'm suggesting is that there has been always a place that has been played by Mathadishas in the question of secular politics, and especially in the question of reservations, which is so crucial for even socially forward castes such as Lingayats and Vokkaligas to claim. As you know, they're continuing to make these claims even today. So as the sociologist Satish Deshpande has described it, socially forward, but claiming that they are educationally and economically backward. So this demand and these Mathadishas as the representatives of these communities has been extremely important. Partly because, as I said, Karnataka is one state which has a very large network of Mathas, and they are in some ways the face of the communities themselves. It's actually quite interesting that in a state like Karnataka, or old Mysore as it used to be, which has a long history of established caste societies, caste groups, associations since at least the 1910s, you have this desire for the Matha form since at least the 1990s, beginning with the Kaginele Mata, the Kuruba Mata, and carrying on with much smaller groups associated to larger matas or independent of them. The mata form has become somehow a vital necessity for even small groups to adopt, partly because of the success of the larger matas in mobilizing funds, mobilizing resources, and being able to establish institutions on a scale that parallels the state, if not outdoes the state. So that is one attraction. But of late, we are seeing yet another form, and that's an interesting one, which is the rise of the caste corporation, which has been established by the state itself. And it has its roots in actually 2008. From 2008 onwards, when these caste corporations for the OBC caste began to be established, we have almost 24 caste corporations now. And they were described, they have been challenged in court, whether in fact development should be through these caste vehicles. And it was described by the Karnataka state in court as the special purpose vehicle. So they're seeing castes and caste corporations as probably the route through which development itself can be delivered. And that's an interesting stage at which we are now, where, you know, it's clearly being demarcated along caste lines, that the delivery of development, programs will be done through the assistance of caste groupings, and in this case, the caste corporations, which have been set up by the state itself.
Unlike in North India, where spiritual gurus have contested elections, in Karnataka, despite their very prominent influence in the state's politics, like you've just said, seers have mostly steered clear of entering the poll fray. What explains this? Why is this happening here?
This is also an interesting question. Those who have studied what they call the political sannyasi in the north, I'm thinking of historians like William Pinch and so on, Malvika Kasturi, they have all noted that the entry of sannyasis into public political life happened in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century to a very large extent in northern India. It did not happen in the south, and in fact, it continues to be something that has not yet happened in a place like Karnataka, partly because they already wield a considerable amount of power without being in electoral politics. They play a role in electoral politics without being in some ways accountable to the voter in the same way that an elected person might be. But of late, as you know, there have been demands. I'm thinking, for instance, of particularly the case of Vasumurthy Madhar Chennaiya, who's been suggesting that he should be given a ticket and he should be allowed to stand in the Chitradurga region and so on and so forth. So he has been making that kind of demand for some time now. The Panchamasali agitation and the Mrityunjaya Swamiji also has been demanding, not for himself, but saying that there has to be greater representation and that there is actually nothing wrong if Swamijis actually come into public political life. So slowly there is a growing sort of recognition of the possible kinds of advantages from direct political engagement. But I think because there has been a very strong and a very stable relationship between these sites of religious power and sites of temporal power for a very long period of time, there hasn't been a need to disturb this here. We didn't have as strong a national movement in the late 19th and the early 20th century, still about the 2020s at least. So that's another reason that, you know, most of the Swamijis who came into public political life in North India were parts of either reform movements or also parts of the actual national movement. So that has not obviously happened here in quite the same way. But it is something that might change. And I think, I suspect, given the kinds of demands that are now made, it might well change.
The might of the mathas may not pose any real danger in the current instance to the status quo of the Congress government. However, their strong and continued influence on the state's political contours will remain a case to be studied. See you in the next episode of Decode Karnataka with me, Nalme Nachiyar. Until then, follow the Hindu, for more such stories and videos.